Western civilization has taken itself out of nature, as opposed to the African, who is in nature and sees the Creator in everything.
But our ancestors acknowledged that there was one Creator, there was one God.
The Creator, the source, the one. The being that we in Western society refer to as God.
Our ancestors knew that we couldn't get to understand the Creator through just one aspect or one component.
And so our ancestors came to their knowledge, their understanding of one Creator through their meticulous study of nature.
The concept of nature, that the African tradition is that we are one with nature. We are nature.
You need to understand the mineral domain, then the plant domain, and then the animal domain.
The African's position on the divinity is that no one can know God. Even in the Christian tradition, they said no one can know God. So the African says, no one can know God, but we can know some of God's attributes and some of God's qualities and some of God's personality.
And as a matter of fact, the word that is oftentimes translated as God, coming from out of ancient Kemet, or what people today call ancient Egypt, is the word necher, from which we get the word nature.
They call them netchers, okay? Necheru.
Aspects of nature. Neteru is the plural for neter. And these are concepts of nature.
So, whereas they came across this term necher, which means power or principle of nature, they translated it to mean gods.
And erroneously, a lot of people call these things gods. The Africans do not call Heru a god, or Hathor a god, or Nephthys a god, or Set a god.
That is an immediate red flag that makes somebody say, hey, wait a minute, there's only one God. All that other stuff, that must be pagan, that must be polytheistic.
A little further south to Congo, that's where you have the longest story. And there again, it's the story where the king is curious about this new faith. But in this case, the king says that I don't merely want to learn from what the Portuguese come to Congo and teach him. He wants to send some of his young men to Europe. He wants them to go there, number one, to be educated, to learn the faith, to observe how this Christian kingdom or kingdoms operate, come back to him, and then confirm whether what the traders or the priests or the missionaries were saying, whether it was true or not. And so in this case, that happens. By 1491, they return. The king then is willing to embrace Christianity, and he's willing to follow it within this model where one has to be the husband of one wife. So we have to get our mind straight that prior to the arrival of the first African and what becomes United States, you have this Christian kingdom or Christian empire with a school system, with chapels, with an educated group of people. And therefore we have to not let the slave trade narrative cloud us to what it was like to be an African Christian along the coast of Africa, or to be an African Christian within Ethiopia, or to be an African Christian within Europe.
Any of you know there's a book in the Bible called the Book of Acts? In the Book of Acts in chapter 8, it talks about an Ethiopian that I prefer to call a captain or a treasurer. Some people call him an Ethiopian eunuch. But he's an Ethiopian that gets baptized. He's, according to Martin Luther, the great reformer of the Protestant church, he, according to Martin Luther, was the first Gentile to be baptized within the church. And so therefore, if one says, if the first non-Jew to be baptized in the church is an African, how can someone say that you received it in servitude?
Every society understands the power of water in different ways. In the U.S., that power has most often been harnessed to support production and industry, like the way the Mississippi River made it possible to transport cash crops grown in the rich soil of the Delta. But in other cultures, it is the spiritual power of water that takes precedent. Centuries ago, in the Kingdom of the Congo, water was seen as a boundary between the physical and the spirit worlds, and a sacred vehicle of transformation in the cycle of life and death. When enslaved people were brought to plantations, often by riverboat, they carried African water rituals with them. The full water immersion of the Christian baptism resonated with people who understood water in terms of spirit, and they hoped that the ritual of transformation would help bring an end to their oppression. Today I'm talking with Amber Drumgoole, a musician and religious scholar, to understand how this ritual fits into the bigger picture. I am sitting here with the most amazing scholar, beautiful, brilliant, smart woman, soon to be Yale graduate, singer. You gonna sing a little bit today?
Maybe a little.
I mean, maybe just a little bit, right?
Bit.
But I am so interested in what you've learned over these past years in your studies. What is a river baptism?
So a river baptism is a ritual that began in the late 19th, early 20th century, where Black church congregations, again, particularly Black Southern church congregations, would take their new converts to a river and baptize them by immersion so that they could become a part of the church and also a part of the body of Christ.
What are the roots of this ritual?
The roots of this ritual tend to come down two different lines. The first is references to West African spirituality. Here we have a deep reverence for the power and the rejuvenation of the water as a place of birth, life, death, danger. The water is just a powerful spiritual essence in and of itself. It can also come down to references to Jesus being baptized in the River Jordan in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So that's a natural synergy between the reverence of the water in West African cosmologies and the water as a space of transformation, both bodily and spiritually, in the Gospels of Jesus. When it comes to using the symbolism and metaphor of the water as a space of possibility, as a space of liminality, to remind us that the water, we took charge of it at one point in our history. There were Black swimmers, Black seafarers, Black divers, Black people who saved people in the water.
Mermaids now.
Mermaids now. But actually, mermaids now, there's also a whole historical idea of the Black mermaid in folklore as well. So we've often used the water as a way to move forward and to see forward in the midst of very trying times. In that way, it's connected to both resistance as well as trials.
So the Reformation is said to begin in 1517 when Martin Luther first challenges some of the teachings of the papacy and the Western Catholic Church. He nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the church at Wittenberg in Germany, and this was supposed to raise a debate and a discussion, but by then the printing press had been discovered or invented, and they spread these 95 Theses throughout Europe, and this causes really just a firestorm of debate. So Martin Luther is put on trial for heresy, he's condemned for heresy, and even though he escapes with his life, this creates a situation in Europe where everyone has to choose. Are we going to go with this new Protestant view, or are we going to trust the papacy and the Catholic Church? Now in Africa, where people like Augustine were from, Christianity has disappeared from North Africa by this time. Under centuries of Islamic rule, they eventually die out of North Africa. But in Egypt and in Ethiopia, there's still a thriving church, so it's called the Coptic Church in Egypt, and with that is the Ethiopian church, which largely functioned independently. With the spread of Islam, these churches really get isolated from the rest of Christianity, and they just continue on in their own way and in their own practices. And so they never really even know about the Reformation or what's happening, and that's partly because they have preserved their own tradition and were not really brought into some of the medieval practices that Martin Luther was protesting.
Were the Essenes the most likely progenitors of early Christians? Why aren't the Essenes mentioned in the New Testament unless the references to the poor, the way, and saints are references to them. Why do the Essenes seem to evaporate just as Christianity begins to precipitate? Thanks again.
Yeah. So I think the Essenes were a much smaller sect than the Sadducees, and much less influential sect than the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The only reason they get prominent mention is because Josephus decides to include them in his list of the top sects. But he includes in the top sects, the 4 sects, he includes the Zealots, basically, which he calls the fourth way. But I think that's because Josephus himself dabbled in Essenism, and I think he still has some sympathies with Essenism, even though he himself is a Pharisee. Weirdly, because he's also was a priest in the temple, so he's which were normally Sadducees. So it's Josephus has an interesting story, but he sampled all these sects and bounced around them. So I think the only reason we get a prominent mention of Essenes is because Josephus's personal history. I think the sect itself is quite small, and so I think in the Gospels, and also the Gospels are written after the war. So this is another important thing. After the war, a lot of this stuff died out. The Sadducees were a thing of the past, basically, because they were so invested in the temple sect. The temple's gone, so that sect was pretty much just devastated. The Pharisees were the ones who mainly survived, and especially were the more popular in the diaspora and could continue. I don't know how popular Essenism actually was among the diaspora, and in Judea, everything got laid waste. So I think Essenism kind of basically died out through circumstances of war and politics of the time. So when the Gospels are being written, the authors aren't even necessarily all that familiar with Essenes, because there aren't a lot of Essenes around, certainly not in the diaspora. They're familiar with the traditional 2 sects that argued with each other, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Those are the sects that they know a lot about. Those are the more popular, more famous sects. So that's why those sects show up in the Gospels. So I don't think we can infer that, for example, Jesus represents the Essenes. Were that the case, they would just say it. And we don't have any direct, it's possible though, but it's not directly stated, so we can't make that inference. And the other aspect of that question is, to what extent is Christianity Essene? And it's a difficult question to answer because Christianity seems to be similar to a lot of sects. Like I was mentioning in another clip, Hillelite Phariseeism is almost identical to Jesus' teaching. So Jesus seems to be a Hillelite Pharisee, right? And that's a thing that wouldn't be obvious to someone who's reading the Gospels and doesn't know the context, because the Pharisees in there are always actually Shammaites, but they're never said to be. It's like the idea of the existence of Hillelite Pharisees is erased from the text. It's not there, and the only way it is there is in the voice of Jesus, right? Jesus is a little bit more conservative than Hillel on some points, but most of what he's arguing is Hillelite Phariseeism. So I think whoever's writing these texts is oversimplifying the reality, because they're thinking, well, we're going to use Pharisees as sort of the old moniker for the old conservative Shammai religion, and we're going to have Jesus as our representative of Hillelite Phariseeism. They wouldn't necessarily have called it that, right? They would know, oh yeah, this is closer to the teachings of Hillel, and Hillel happened to be a Pharisee, yada yada. They would see it as their own way. It's their own sect. They're not Pharisees. They're their own thing. They're actually rebelling against Phariseeism, even though most of their ideas are coming from the liberal wing of Phariseeism. But there's a lot of stuff in Jesus that's put in the mouth of Jesus, and we find in the letters of Paul, that very much resembles the Essenes. And also there's a lot of overlap between that, the Essenes, and the Dead Sea sect. So a lot of scholars have suggested that the Dead Sea sect, if it was one sect, it might even been the stash of documents from multiple sects, for all we know. But even if it was one sect, it does seem to be related to the Essenes. Now, if you go looking through the literature and the ancient discussions of the Essenes, there is a definite assumption at the time that the Essenes were an offshoot of the Samaritans, which is an interesting, if you look at that, then that pulls in Samaritanism, and there are other people who have suggested there's aspects of Samaritanism in Jesus' teaching too. And so like this gets really complicated, and I don't think we can really nail it down. I think there's multiple influences coming in, they're doing their own thing. The one place where you could hope to nail it down, but we can't because the sources are gone, would be what sect was it before it was Christian? Right, because we have like the 1 Corinthians 15, it says, Jesus appeared to Cephas and the 12. And we know there was a 12 in the Dead Sea sect. It was representing, because they were the countercultural sect. They were anti-temple. They were they were creating their own, basically survivalist community. and setting up their own government to represent the true government. And they had their own quorum of 12, who presumably would replace the leadership of the 12 tribes in the end times, because the temple cult's going to get destroyed by God because they fuck those guys, basically.
Scrolls comes to us from two ancient scholars, both of whom were contemporaries of the 1st century Essenes, Josephus Flavius and Philo of Alexandria. Josephus was born at Jerusalem in 37 AD, the greatest historian of the Jews in that period. Philo was the greatest Jewish philosopher of that time. Both men had personal knowledge of the ancient Essenes. Both scholars make clear that the Essenian roots are incredibly ancient. Josephus declares that the Essenes have existed from time immemorial and countless generations. Philo agrees, calling the Essenes the most ancient of all initiates, with a teaching perpetuated through an immense space of ages. Records of the Essene way of life have come down to us from writings of their contemporaries. Pliny, the Roman naturalist, and others spoke of them variously as a race by themselves, more remarkable than any other in the world. The oldest of the initiates, receiving their teaching from Central Asia, teaching perpetuated through an immense space of ages, constant and unalterable holiness, unquote. Josephus and Philo, as well as several other ancient writers, including Pliny the Elder, are in consensus on 2 points in regards to the origins of the Essenes. Their origin is lost in prehistory, with certain ancient legends linking them with Enoch. And secondly, there was a major remanifestation of the Essenes by Moses at Mount Sinai. Enoch lived many centuries before Moses in the 5th chapter of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Enoch is described as the 7th from Adam, which means he was born 7 generations after Adam, since 7 in Essene numerology is the number of perfection. It is no mere coincidence that Enoch represents the 7th generation of humanity. He represents perfected humanity. While much of the Enochian legend cited above is found only in Essene Kabbalah texts, it stems directly from the Bible. Genesis chapter 5, verse 24. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The fact that Enoch was considered the founder or initiator of the Essenes can even be seen in his name. The word Enoch means in Hebrew, founder, initiator, centralizer. The Essenes have their roots in Egypt during the late 18th dynasty. These were equated with purity and the polarity of light as opposed to darkness. It is unclear as to exactly when that brotherhood, as it is called, was formed, but many of the rules and regulations appear to have been formulated by Pharaoh Tumutsi III. The aim of this group, of this movement, of this brotherhood, was to preserve the great knowledge attained by the wisest of Egypt. It could in some ways be seen as a school of philosophy. Students from around the globe traveled to Egypt in order to study under their directorship.
Much into the pre-Christian history and all the saints and all the mystics and so forth. So in the 80s, when I stumbled on the Aramaic language, that was the key for me to reopen the New Testament and the whole story of Yeshua and Mary the Magdalene. And I must also stress that from now on, every time I talk about Yeshua, I'm talking about Mary the Magdalene. And every time I'm talking about her, I talk about Yeshua. They are inseparable. So, and I'll come back to that. But so my book is actually built up on 2 very old practices. You may have heard about the Merkabah practices, the chariot of fire practice, which is to a certain limit, known to a very few people, because it consists of 7 lines, and only the 6 of them are available to practice. So you really miss the whole thing if you haven't got the 7th lines. And being aware of that the Essenes their only purpose was to pave the way for their Messiah or for the teacher of righteousness.
This teaching has existed, is unknown. To study and practice this teaching is to reawaken within the heart of every man an intuitive knowledge that can solve his individual problems and the problems of the world. Traces of this teaching have appeared in almost every religion. Its fundamental principles were taught in ancient Persia and Egypt, India, Tibet and China, Palestine and Greece, and many other countries. But it has been transmitted in its most pure form by the Essenes, that mysterious brotherhood, which lived during the last 2 or 3 centuries BC and the 1st century of the Christian era in the Dead Sea in Palestine and Lake Marotus in Egypt. It's in Palestine and Syria the members of the brotherhood were known as the Essenes, and in Egypt, therapeutai, or healers. The origin of the brotherhood is said to be unknown, and the derivation of its name is uncertain. Some believe it comes from Enoch and claim him to be their founder, their communion with the angelic world having been first given to him. But whatever their origin, it is certain the Essenes existed for a very long time as a brotherhood, perhaps under other names in other lands. The teaching appears in the teachings of the Zoroaster, who translated it into a way of life that was followed for thousands of years. It contains the fundamental concepts of Brahmanism. The systems of India sprang from this same source. Buddha later gave forth essentially the same basic ideas, and his sacred Bodhi tree correlated with the Essene tree of life. Ancient Greece also followed these principles and a way of life. The same teaching was an element of the Adamic culture of the Phoenicians, the Alexandrian school of philosophy in Egypt, and contributed greatly to many branches of Western culture, Freemasonry, Gnosticism, and the Kabbalah, and Christianity. Jesus interpreted them with the 7 Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount. The Essenes lived on the shores of the lakes and rivers away from cities and towns and practiced a communal way of life, sharing equally in everything. They were mainly agriculturists and arboriculturists, having a vast knowledge of crops, soil, and climate conditions, which enabled them to grow a great variety of fruits, vegetables, and in comparatively desert areas with a minimum amount of labor. They had no servants or slaves, and they were said to have been the first people to condemn slavery, both in theory and in practice. There were no rich, and there were no poor amongst them, both conditions being considered by them as deviations from the natural laws.